Well, it's really, really wonderful to be here, and Joe and I have been talking about me coming for several months, and it all worked out. And I'm here because of synchronicities. How many of you have ever experienced mind-boggling synchronicities? Yes, it's part of the mystical path, I believe. How many of you here have ever found yourselves growing beyond the belief system that you inherited or grew up in? Yeah, so that's one of the things that we're going to explore today, is that experience, when our mystical experiences take us beyond the tradition that we have been part of and that we have perhaps identified very deeply with. And it's sort of a rocky road. Oftentimes that process can be filled with a lot of emotions, grief, loneliness, sometimes a feeling of betrayal when we feel that the tradition has let us down or somehow held us back. So it's a very interesting process, and I want to later on in my talk explore the question with you, are we betraying the tradition when we move beyond it? So it's just a question that I want to have us hold together. Well, Joe told me that, as he just said, that they love for speakers to share something of their stories. So I'm going to do that. And I'm going to do a little bit of reading from my book, Beyond Jesus, My Spiritual Odyssey. And, I mean, if you really wanted to know my story, it's here. So I'm not going to tell you the whole thing. There's too much to tell. But I will just give you some overviews, and I'll give you a few really pivotal moments in my own spiritual journey that give you a sense of how things have evolved for me and how they have led me to see the world and reality and my tradition of Christianity and Jesus very differently. So I am from Denver, Colorado, and grew up in a very conventional Christian family. We were Presbyterians because my father's family came from Scotland. And the Presbyterian Church, of course, is the Church of Scotland, so we were very loyal to that tradition. We went to church every Sunday. I went to Sunday school, had mostly good experiences. Went to vacation Bible school as a young person and was pretty much inculcated in a very conventional viewpoint and Christian belief system. It was very clear and self-evident that, there's a God, that God is like somewhere up there, not really defined exactly. Jesus was God's one and only Son. Jesus died for our sins. Humans are born with the stain of the original sin and need to be redeemed. And so that was the belief system that I grew up in, and wasn't really exposed to anything different for quite a while. After college, well, as an undergraduate, I studied a year in Germany, what was in West Germany, and I was drawn to go to Germany because for as long as I could remember, I had been haunted by the Holocaust. I could not fathom how that could have happened. And so I went to Germany looking for some answers. And I'm sorry to say that I didn't really get the answers I was looking for, because the people seemed pretty normal. And I was like, wow, if that could happen here among these normal people, it could happen anywhere. And during that year when I was studying abroad, it really opened up my horizons to the political realities of our world. And I had my eyes opened to some of the things that my own country had been doing that I had never been taught. Some of the escapades, the covert escapades of our own government. And I felt deeply, deeply betrayed. And I felt like I had been hoodwinked. I'd been duped. And so when I came back to the States as a senior in college, I decided to change my major. Well, add on a major. I was a music major at the time. And I decided to complete my German major and my music major, but also to study international affairs, because I wanted to understand more. I was appalled at the level of my ignorance about the political realities of our world and my own government. And so I got that degree, and then I went into the Peace Corps in Ecuador, in South America. And I worked and lived for 2 years in the high Andes. And the second year that I was there, I was working among the Quichua Indians in this small village, altitude 11,000 feet. It helped coming from Colorado, it's a little bit adjusted, but it was quite an extraordinary experience to witness the level of economic disparity between the indigenous Quichua and the descendants of the conquistadores. And every time that I would go from Quito, the capital city, back out to my village, Colta, I went through, it was like whiplash, culture shock every time. And as I looked around at the horrible poverty and the horrible discrimination, now, mind you, I had arrived with this degree that had focused on economics and political science and international law and all of this stuff that you study as someone majoring in international affairs. So I came on the scene with this idea that politics can solve problems. And I got to Ecuador and I looked around and I just had the sense that there is a spiritual sickness at the heart of this. This goes way beyond politics. And I had a couple of pretty extraordinary moments during my time there where my own awareness was opened up quite a lot. And I lived in a part of the country where there had been missionaries. There had been missionary activity there for some time, and I was very ambivalent about it, because I saw it as sort of a form of cultural imperialism, religious imperialism. So I was very ambivalent about that. And yet I also saw that the Quichuas were more able to understand the heart of the gospel than people in North America, because they were hearing it in a very different way. That, whoa, we're beloved children of God. Nobody ever told us that before. So I had this very interesting mixture of experiences there. But it was while I was in the Peace Corps in Ecuador that the seed was planted in me that I would end up doing some sort of ministry. And so when I came back to the States, I put that on hold, and I taught school for a while, ESL and Spanish. But every time I thought about my future, I saw myself as doing some sort of ministry. And finally I thought, well, if that's what I'm seeing, I might as well get on with it. So I applied to seminary, and I left for California to study at the San Francisco Theological Seminary in the Bay Area. Well, while I was there, speaking of dreams, Joe, I started having these momentous dreams, some very disturbing dreams, and so powerful that I knew I needed to understand them. And so I started studying dream interpretation and trying to understand these dreams, because I knew that spirit, that some presence was breaking into my life. And I will just share a little snippet of one of the dreams, because it relates to what we're talking about here. In this one dream, I'm studying in the library of the seminary. And in the dream, the library is a garden-level room, so that The windows are up towards the top, towards the ceiling. And I'm in there studying, and all of a sudden, there is this tremendous earthquake. And the building is shaking and rocking, and then there are vines that were growing outside the windows that start to grow at this explosive rate, and they shatter the windows, and they start filling the library, and the building is collapsing, and I'm thinking, I have got to get out of here or I will die. And I run for the stairs, and I run outside, and I end up in this courtyard that's beautiful and sunny and peaceful, and I come upon a baby with a live butterfly in its mouth. And that dream was telling me that some numinous spirit was breaking in and crashing through the windows of this theological structure where I was studying other people's vicarious experiences, other people's understandings of God, of reality, and it was time I had to leave that library or I would die. And it was a terrifying dream, and a dream full of hope, because I knew that something was working on my behalf. And then I had another dream the following night that was extremely disturbing, that revealed to me the extent to which I had internalized the sexism and the misogyny of my tradition. And it was heart-wrenching. Absolutely heart-wrenching. And in the wake of that dream, I literally had this ache in my heart that I had never experienced. It was almost as much as I could do just to go to class, because I felt so betrayed that my religious tradition had taught me something about what it means to be a woman. And God, as the supreme misogynist, if you will. It was a very painful experience, and I wondered if I could stay in the church, if I could be ordained and serve in the church. I was fortunate to have a very good friend who was, she was going through some similar struggles at the time. And I tell you, if you're ever going through a dark night, it helps so much to have a friend who's doing that with you. It's like a lifeline. So Tricia was my lifeline. And she and I were struggling with these questions and crying together and trying to come to terms with it all. And I had the good fortune of doing an internship in a very progressive church in Tucson, Arizona, that gave me hope that I could serve in the church if it's the right congregation. And so I completed seminary and I was ordained. And I met my husband in seminary. We co-pastored in Missouri for about 5 years, and then I received a call. Kip, my husband, pastoring wasn't for him, and so he followed me to Philadelphia, and I served at church near the University of Pennsylvania, Tabernacle United Church, which is a union church, Presbyterian and UCC. Wonderful, progressive congregation. And it was like the honeymoon never ended. However, in 2001, Tricia, who had aplastic anemia, underwent a bone marrow transplant because the disease is fatal. The only cure is to undergo a bone marrow transplant. And so she did, and as a result, she died. And it was at her death that my own spiritual path took a radical turn. It was a tremendous loss to lose this very dear friend who had been such a spiritual companion. And in the immediate aftermath of her death, I knew that I did not want to live my life on the surface. I sensed that there was some dimension of my existence that I had never known. And I wanted to know what that was. And so I resolved. It's like, I don't know if you've ever had this experience, but it's like my own will just went chink, 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 just aligned with this resolve. And when we do that, when our will aligns like that with an intention, I believe we set things in motion. So a year after Tricia died, I went on spiritual retreat in New Mexico. And while I was there, I renewed my resolve to open up to whatever this hidden dimension was that I had not yet experienced. And there are pieces of my story that I'm leaving out, like I took a trip to El Salvador that was also pivotal in all of this. But shortly after that retreat, I guess about four or 5 months, I started to experience, again, all of these synchronicities, like one after the other, that my worldview could not accommodate. My rational worldview, just like things like this don't happen. And so I knew that something was afoot, something was happening, and I knew that I needed to surrender to it. I didn't know what else to do. I just knew I needed to surrender to it. So I'm going to read, and I had taken to going to the woods, the Wissahickon Woods, once a week in the aftermath of Tricia's death. It was my pilgrimage place. So I knew I needed to surrender, and I knew the place that I needed to go was to the woods. And I think it's so beautiful that we are gathering here so close to that place. And this was in July. And I'm hiking into the woods that Friday afternoon. And as I'm hiking, there's a light rain that starts to fall. And I go to the rock where I would sometimes go to meditate. And I sat down, and the rain started to fall harder. And I didn't know what to do. I did not know what to do, except the only thing that could occur to me was to start giving thanks for the people in my life. Because I had some sense that whatever was going on in my life was because of the web of relationships that I was in. And so I just started to say thank you, and I started to name the names. And as soon as I did that, I had this sudden realization. It's like my eyes were opened to this realization that I am not a separate self. I am not a separate entity, as I've always experienced myself to be. And I saw that I was more like, there were these patterns, like interacting waves, like on the surface of a lake, and they're all interacting and all affecting each other. And there is no separate self there. And as soon as I had that, I was a dynamic pattern, constantly changing, expressing the interplay of an infinite number of interacting influences, like ripples constantly dancing and colliding on the surface of water. In a flash, I comprehended not only the interconnectedness of reality, but of my own interconnectedness with reality. I, as a separate entity, did not exist. Isolation and separateness had only been erroneous ideas in my mind. With that realization, waves of energy began to cascade through my body, pulsating through me. I sobbed and I sobbed and I sobbed. I could feel that something was being set free at the deepest levels of my being. I was being birthed into a new reality. As the waves of energy began to subside, the rain began to let up. When I opened my eyes, I saw a world that I had never seen before. Everything. The pool of tears at my feet, the rock, the trees, the sparkling, mica-laden soil. Everything was vibrant and alive, luminous, infused with a presence. No, not merely a presence, a sentience. Nothing was inanimate. Everything was expressing a life, a totality, a complete oneness, love itself. Beholding the beauty of all that was around me, an immense hope for the earth filled my being. I knew that a profound shift was underway, not just in me, but across the entire planet. I had no doubt that if enough people were to give themselves over to this inbreaking of love, the earth itself could be healed. In the aftermath of that experience, for several days, I was in a very heightened state of consciousness, and the energy continued to flow through my body, and at times my hands felt like they were on fire, my feet felt like they were on fire. And I felt as though information was being downloaded. Information about the nature of reality, information about the world and the story that we're living out. We're living out a story on this planet. It's a story based on a fallacy of separateness. And this story gets played out not only in our own minds and relationships, but it gets played out on the world stage in the form of empire, in the form of exploitive economic systems. It's like it's all a big story that we're playing out. And as the energy and the information continued to accelerate, I had this breakthrough where everything just sort of converged like a flash of lightning with this realization that we are in a dream. That we are living out an unconscious story. It is a dream. And as people awaken to that, we can become lucid dreamers. We can begin to interact very differently, not following the script that's handed to us, but as active and proactive agents, bringing forth a new story, transforming the story on this planet. Well, all of this put me in a challenging position. Now, there's a lot of... It was not a cakewalk. My own ego got temporarily sidelined. I had this amazing awakening experience. Ego returned, as ego does. And then there was this long process of working through all of that. Oh, the ego loves to grab hold of situations like that. I mean, doesn't that make me special? That's what the ego loves, to be special. To be set apart, that's the nature of ego. And the more I really was immersed in this process, the more I could see that that very ego consciousness, and by that I mean that consciousness of separateness, that was the consciousness that shaped Christian belief. And I came to see how Jesus at his baptism had that awakening experience where the veil between heaven and earth is torn apart. There is no separateness. There is no judgment. There is no condemnation. There's nothing but love. And he had to go out into the wilderness and face his own egoic temptations. The temptations to be special, the temptations to use power on his own behalf. And yet in the end, that's exactly what the tradition did. Jesus is special. Jesus is set apart. So the very idea of that egoic fallacy of separateness became woven into the tradition, into the belief system. And so I found myself in this very challenging spot. Here I am, a clergy person, representing a belief system that no longer holds true for me. And for many years, I tried to find a way to reconcile it, to hold it all together. I tried really hard. It was my vocation. It was my spiritual community. I loved my congregation. I loved my work. But in the end, I could see that this had been my journey. This had not been my congregation's journey. And more than that, there is this institutional architecture that I experienced to be quite rigid. It's as though the foundation and the cornerstone were laid with a particular orientation. And how do you work with that? Now, along the way, so there was not only the theological struggle and the Christological struggle, and seeing how the tradition had distorted Jesus' message, which I believe he was embodying and teaching this non-dual consciousness. Some call it Christ consciousness, unitive consciousness, whatever it was, whatever term you want to use. That's what he was embodying and calling people into. So I was wrestling with the theological thing, but then I was also seeing how this consciousness of separateness is playing out in our world and how it has wrought so much devastation. That's why we're on the brink of this environmental crisis. That's why we have these vast disparities of wealth. And I came to understand that if we want to heal the world, we'll have to do this work in our own minds, in our own consciousnesses. We'll have to move beyond that separateness within ourselves if we want the world to be transformed. So I began questioning the foundations of the tradition that I was raised in and that I served and that I represented as a pastor. And in the end, I realized through dreams and synchronicities again that it was time for me to go. And so I resigned that position in 2010 and embarked on doing some writing, teaching. And there were other things that I did. I was involved in nonviolent civil disobedience. I served a week in federal prison down on 7th and Arch in the Federal Detention Center for engaging in nonviolent civil disobedience when the U.S. launched the invasion of Iraq. And going into that prison was also very much like a dream experience. Because if you want to talk about the consciousness of separateness, what exemplifies that more than prison? And so I and the other people who had participated in that action, who chose actually to go to prison rather than pay the fine, we went with the intention to bring a different energy into that space, a different consciousness into that space. Because I think actually that's what we're all now here to do, is to bring a different energy and a different consciousness into these times. So I want to talk then about mysticism. Are we betraying the tradition when we grow beyond it? And I think a lot of times we can feel that we are, because these often are belief systems that we've received from family, from society, from culture. They've shaped us. And in a way, it's sort of like, am I turning my back on my my parent. But I've really come to understand that when religions get institutionalized, what they are institutionalizing largely is the predominant consciousness that is present at the time that it becomes codified. At the time that the doctrines are created, those are reflecting the dominant consciousness of that era. It's the best they could do. If you're living in that egoic consciousness, you can't even comprehend what a unity of consciousness is. It's just beyond you. And so I think that actually when we grow beyond the institution or beyond the tradition, we're not betraying it at all. We're being faithful and loyal to the figure, the founding figure, who had explored and exposed a consciousness that was ahead of its time. And there's this line in the New Testament where Jesus says, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish, but to fulfill." And when we allow these mystical experiences, this inbreaking of this other consciousness, this inbreaking of divine energy, when we allow that to open us up, we are being so faithful to the intention. We are fulfilling the intention. I want to just finish up this part of my talk. We'll have questions and answers a little bit later, but I want to just read a little bit from the introduction to my book. So I'll say a word about this. So this is a book that I tried really hard not to write. I tried so hard not to write this book. I felt like my story was one that wanted to be told, but I didn't want to tell my story. I just wasn't comfortable with it. I was a closeted mystic. And so I wrote a novel, and I put my story in the backstory of one of the characters of the novel. So I could get the story out there, but I wouldn't have to claim it as my own. And then this writing teacher who knew the project that I was working on, and she knew something of my own experiences and background, she said, "Patricia, this story has power because it happened to you. You need to tell it as your story." And I was thinking, oh, shit. But I think she was right. So when I left the church in 2010, and as it so happens, my mother was also in the process of dying. She was in hospice. And so I was faced with two monumental losses in my life at the same time. The death of my biological mother and the death of Mother Church. The death of my vocation, the death of my career. It was not a happy time. Almost a year after she died, I was driving. By that time, I had left my position at Tabernacle. I was driving across country from Philadelphia to Denver to participate in my mother's ash scattering. And I was driving because there were some things that I wanted to bring back with me. And while I was on the road, I was listening to some podcasts of Krista Tippett's. And there was one interview she was doing with a man who had done a documentary film on Bonhoeffer. And I'm driving through Ohio on the interstate. It's like an interstate. You know what that's like. And all of a sudden, I get this download, just like this flash, just boom, that I would write a book called Beyond Jesus that would talk about how ego consciousness had shaped Christian belief. It was crystal clear. I totally got the intention. It's like, okay. And I felt like the best way to write the book was to share my story and to share some of the experiences that had led me to that understanding, the understanding that the book wants to bring forth. So I'm going to close with a passage from the introduction of the book. If we consider Jesus to be a doorway, as many people do, then we must ask, what is he a doorway to? One does not stop at a doorway nor fixate upon it. One moves through it to the other side. That is its purpose. When we focus our spiritual journey on Jesus himself, when we stop at the doorway, we fail to see what he was showing us about our own nature. We abdicate the power he was demonstrating it was possible to attain when we shed the limited and limiting ego. We deprive ourselves of the beautiful and ecstatic experience of our own oneness with ultimate reality. Jesus was able to be a conduit for divine purposes because he himself had moved beyond Jesus. He had moved beyond the narrow confines of a particular identity and into the full realization that we were and always had been one with the source of being. I believe it is both possible and essential that we do the same, because only in the light of awakened consciousness can the collective nightmare of the ego and its empires ever dissolve. This book is written as a memoir. In the pages to follow, I share a bit about my upbringing in mainstream Protestantism, the events that led me to seminary and then the ministry, and the spiritual awakenings that caused me to see Jesus in a new light. Epiphanies that ultimately made it impossible for me to stay in the institutional church. It also tells the story of how my spirituality has been deeply influenced by what I have witnessed in the political realm. From the impoverished regions of the Andes, where I served as a Peace Corps volunteer, to the federal prison where I served a sentence for nonviolent civil disobedience when the United States invaded Iraq, I have seen how our political systems are an outward manifestation of the beliefs we hold about who we are and about the nature of reality. As our consciousness matures, those systems will also undergo a profound change. While this book is written as a memoir, it is also a manifesto pointing to what we might become. Each of our lives is a hologram, holding the patterns of the evolution of our collective existence. So while the details of any life story are particular, the narrative arc is one that we share. We are participating in a great unfolding on this planet. The emergence of a new consciousness that sees through the fallacy of separateness. As the beliefs of a previous age dissolve and the structures and institutions spawned by those beliefs crumble, a new world will become possible. One in which we take our place as co-creators in a cosmos awakening to itself. This book is an offering to the emergence of that new world, to the great flowering of our spiritual potential that Jesus demonstrated, and the promise it holds for our collective future. I would love to, just before we move into questions and answers, I would love for us to just like in little triads, 2s, 3s, just share with someone an experience that you may have had when you found yourself moving beyond a belief system that you had inherited or grown up with, and how you navigated that. So just in a couple of, let's just take like a few minutes to do this, just to share with one another our own experiences of moving beyond our tradition. Well, thank you, everybody, for sharing in your small groups, and also those of you who shared in the larger group. And now we're going to open it up for a few minutes for Q&A. If you have any questions that you'd like to pose to me, based on if you've read my book, anything in the book, or based on what I've shared with you, or just whatever. Well, I don't belong to a spiritual community, a formal spiritual community. I've gone to Quaker meeting on occasion, and I love music, so that it's like if the Quakers, if I could get them to sing, I would be there in a heartbeat. But I'm very fortunate to have a circle of very close friends who we are spiritual companions together. It's not a worship context, but it's very much, I think of it as my spiritual community, really, yeah.
You mentioned the first book. Did you write a second book?
Actually, Beyond Jesus is my second book. My first book is called No One in Island, A Parable of Awakening. And this is a very playful book. And it's a very playful book. And people laugh when they read it. And one woman who read it asked me, Did you write this knowing about Trump? I said, no, I started writing this in 2006, published it before Trump was on the scene as a political figure. But it's very playful. It's sort of like a parable. It conveys the same message that Beyond Jesus does, but in a very different way, very different. Here. Or I can repeat the question. Yeah.
I just wanted to ask Patricia what your practice, your spiritual practice is, how you, as a ground, that mystical experience on a daily basis.
Well, I have a fairly robust spiritual life and spiritual practice. I meditate daily. I have a journaling practice. I do a lot of dream work. And I also, and I think, it's just mindfulness, practicing mindfulness. It's not anything that you all don't already know about, but it's, I think, really committing to doing that. And also, I've become more and more aware of, I've become really quite adept at watching the workings of my own mind and being able to disengage and divest from those egoic thoughts. And it's an ongoing practice. But I think I think the more we do this, the more we practice mindfulness, the more we meditate, the better we get at noticing our own minds and noticing the subtle shifts and the thought patterns that I know to be erroneous, I know to be illusion, and to just start to withdraw my investment and my belief in them. And I go on a retreat, which is also tremendously helpful to me. Tremendously helpful. Yeah. Labyrinth. I walk a labyrinth whenever I can.
Hi, I'm Sherry. I was wondering, on your path within the church, did you find any contemporary theologians that were trying to change the church from within?
Yes and no. I would say there are associations, like there's something called the Center for Progressive Christianity that is trying to do that. What I found was I didn't feel, so here's what I believe. I believe that if the church were able to relinquish its ego attachment, it could become a movement to help awaken us all to our Christ consciousness or our non-dual consciousness. But the experiences that I had that were more like the progressive theologians seemed to still sort of be operating in a dualistic mindset. And it often is sort of like the liberal branch of the church can look at the conservative branch of the church as the enemy. There's a lot of like assumed enemy stuff, which is also an ego, construct. So I didn't. To answer your question, no, I didn't. Richard Rohr would be an example of someone who's doing that.
In his readings, he has readings from other people.
Yes.
Who, if you explore them,
Yes.
are really right.
Yeah, I think a lot of them are at this point sort of outside the church, but there are some like Richard Rohr has stayed in the church, in the institution. Yeah.
When they say, what person would you like to have dinner with? It could be anybody, and for me it would be like Jesus, like without the church, like just totally Jesus. I've had several experiences and he has like regressions where I have been in the presence of Jesus. And I guess I just keep searching. I do like searches on Amazon, like, is there a book about Jesus without the church? Like, do you have any, like, guidance, or does anybody have any, like, I want to experience what that Christ consciousness or whatever is more and more in my life and feel that. And I don't know where to go. And I don't know if I can let go of my baggage about Jesus either.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's another thing that, and it's actually, I opened my book with a vignette of being in the sanctuary, rehearsing a scripture passage that I'd memorized for the upcoming worship service, and and as I was reciting it, the sanctuary was, empty, but I felt this profound grief that didn't feel like it was my grief. It felt like it was beyond me. But it was about this very thing, this deep grief that not only has Jesus been made the exception rather than the example, but also because of the ways that the tradition has abused power, has turned so many people away from Jesus and his teaching. And it's really sad. I was at a neighborhood coffee shop, some years back, but I was standing at the counter and I happened to look up and somebody on the wall behind the barista, there was a little note up there that said, Jesus slaves. And I was heartbroken Because that's so the opposite. That's so the opposite. But that has been the distortion. And I actually believe that that consciousness, that embodied as Jesus, is very available and present to us and very active in the world right now, extremely active in the world right now. I'm going to toss your question out to the group. Does anybody have book recommendations? Richard Rohr. He just came out with a book called The Universal Christ. I'm sorry? Yes, The Divine Dance. Yeah, I would look up anything by Richard Rohr would be good. Mm-hmm. Thich Nhat Hanh. Yeah, Thich Nhat Hanh wrote a book, Christ and Buddha and Christ as Brothers or something like that. Yeah. Beyond Jesus.
Does anyone have any favorite movies that might address this?
What was the recent Jesuits movie that was
One of my favorites is What the Belief Do You Know?
7 years in Tibet.
7 years in Tibet. Elaine Pagels, yes. Theologian at Princeton, I believe, right? Elaine Pagels. And she's explored the Gnostic Gospels. I think Gnosticism, there's a lot of dualism in Gnosticism. However, there's also, I think, some carryover of that Christ consciousness as well. I heard something else over here.
What really did it for me 40 years ago that just did it was Thich Nhat Hanh's book.
Right, and I actually, again, synchronicities, right? After I wrote this book, No One in Island, I was invited to go up to Connecticut to speak to a church group. Somebody in that church group had read it and really wanted me to talk to their group about it. And before the meeting that evening, he took me to dinner before the gathering, and we were sitting in this restaurant booth, and he leans over and sort of quietly says about No One in Island, he said, "It's a lot like A Course in Miracles." And I said, I've never read it. It's like, okay, I've never read it. But then, these synchronicities always blow me away. So speaking of medical mission sisters, I was at the Hermitage, one of the Hermitages up in Fox Chase on spiritual retreat several years ago. And there was a little shelf. I was making room on the shelf to put some of my books up, and so I was moving the books off that were on the shelf, and they all tumbled to the floor. And as I'm picking them up, among the books is this little booklet that says Introduction to A Course in Miracles. And I'm like, all right. I'd always gone like this. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Course, but I'd always thought, oh, that is so woo-woo. I'm not even going close to that. Anyway, so I sat down to read this booklet, and I was blown away. Because the booklet was talking about so much that was completely resonant with my own experience, including that this world is a dream. And I was like, whoa. So I started, when I got home, obviously I bought A Course in Miracles, and I've been studying it ever since. But yes, it's a channeled work, and I think there's a lot of amazing channeled work that's coming through right now. Amazing. Let me put a plug in. Wherever I talk, I like to plug this book. Write it down, everybody. What in the World is Going On? Wisdom Teachings for Our Time. What in the World is Going On? And it was channeled by a woman who used to be dean of Mount Holyoke College. And the entity that is bringing in the teaching is Manjushri, Manjushri is a Tibetan figure, wisdom. And it is an extraordinary book. I do a better job of promoting Penny's book than I do promoting my own. I just think it's an extraordinary work, so you all might find it to be very... Yes, What in the World is Going On? Wisdom Teachings for Our Time. And it puts this whole global thing that's happening in this amazing context that will help you see things really differently and really step up to the plate of this amazing historic moment that we are in.
Well, let's give our speaker a break and say thank you. Come up. She'd love to chat with you, look at her book. I want to put in a plug, too, for your podcast. Patricia has a podcast online and deals with many of the questions you're asking. I mean, some of them are almost exactly the types of questions you're asking. So if you go to her website, or you can go through ours and find hers, and then there's a link to the podcast there. Are they weekly or monthly?
Yeah, they're weekly podcasts. Usually they're ones that I do solo, but sometimes I also interview people. I interviewed Penny Gill, who brought this book forth. And you can sign up for my newsletter up here. There's a sign-up sheet, and then you'll get updates on the podcast. Also, I'm starting up this coming week. I'm starting up, I'm excited about this, a monthly online gathering. I'm calling it the We Awakening Circle, and it will be a time when people can bring questions about anything that I address on the podcast or just questions about their spiritual lives, and then it will also be a time where people can share their own wisdom, their own insights, and I'm looking forward to compiling the collective wisdom. So there's one more day to sign up for that. I'm just starting it this Thursday. I'm closing registration the end of tomorrow because I want this first group to really coalesce before we have, new people coming in. So if you sign up for my newsletter, I will let you know about that and give you a link to that. And also I have a sign-up sheet here. I do some one-on-one work with people, spiritual companioning and consulting, so if you're interested in that. And also I'm considering starting up some spiritual companioning groups. So if you're interested in any of that, you can come sign up here and I will be in touch with you. And both my books, of course, are available.
Well, that is great. So come up, talk to her, ask your questions, and have more snacks, because we don't want to take any of that home. So thank you for coming, and we look forward to seeing you at our next meeting in September.
Thank you.